All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Apollo fireside chat with one of the folks we've been working with for a long time here at Apollo and has been going down the path of a data graph. We've got with us today Daljit Summan, a principal at RS Components. And Daljit's been part of the team that's been building a data graph across the organization. And what we're going to talk about today is how that's happened, what he's learned, the impact that's had, and then we'll take your questions. The housekeeping item I want to share with everyone is that the way we're doing this is you can post questions in your GoToMeeting chat panel. Daljit and I can both see those, and so we'll look for questions as we're talking and thread those into the conversation and try to get to as much of that as we can today. So please post what you'd like to know most about, and we'll let that guide the conversation that we have. Why don't I jump right in, and I'll just introduce myself as well. I'm Matt Bergelis, CTO and co-founder here at Apollo, and maybe I can start, Daljit, by saying welcome. Thanks for doing this with us. And maybe you can start by just telling us a little bit about RS Components and what the business is, what kind of company it is, and what you do there.
Okay, so firstly, thank you for having myself and RS Components here. Appreciate the platform and the ability to tell our story. So from our perspective, a little bit about myself. Predominantly a front-end engineer. Started computing probably about at the age of 9 on computers that used to have tapes on them. I wish they'd come back. And kind of progressed through the career, having odd jobs in tech, starting from pick chip programming through to back end and databases, all the way to where I love things the most, which is the front end. However, in the recent years, this GraphQL thing has really grabbed me by the throat. I have no idea why. It's very interesting to me in terms of not the tech as such, but what it solves in organizations and what it facilitates. Now, regarding RS, it's a huge multi-billion pound company, operates in over 33 locales around the world, and we deal predominantly in shipping electronic parts. And you might say, well, we can order things like that from other manufacturers, Amazon, so to speak. But where RS is different is the quality of service. So at Amazon, you buy something, you don't really know what's going to be sent to you. And that's where RS strives to be better, is quality of service. So that's on the outside. And then we're bringing that back into inside and reflect on it ourselves. And then hence this chat about how and what's happening inside to drive up quality from the internal perspective as well.
I want to come back to this idea of customer centric and how the graph, we so often see companies adopting it that have that as their North Star and want to ensure that the product experience connects to the customers in a real way. Maybe for some context around that, how did the graph come to RS Components? What was that process like? And maybe just set the stage for where you are today with your adoption and the journey toward a data graph.
So that's a bit of a okay, I'm going to cut that story short because I could go on for hours itself. It was quite serendipitous the way it actually happened. It wasn't planned. It was there was a group of people, myself included, and then we hadn't met yet, and we knew of GraphQL and what problems it solved, but we hadn't met in the organization, so to speak. And one of the problems we had was the whole disparate nature of REST services. How do you manage something like that? And as you probably appreciate, larger the company, the larger the number of people, the larger these problems effectively spider out. And that can cause great amounts of stress. And ultimately, if we're building solutions for ourselves, and the primary thing we're trying to fix is we want to reduce the amount of stress in the organization around us. We make better decisions when we're less stressed, we're happier, and we work better, and we enjoy our jobs more. So without eulogizing too much about this whole thing, but so GraphQL came in at the point where we kind of understood at RS components that, hang on, in the back end, there seem to be contracts all over the place. This contract thing must be a good thing. And we were yet to see, or yet to see an implementation of, well, how do you do contracts at the edge? And what does good look like? And it was effectively GraphQL that we thought, well, okay, well, this seems to solve nearly every problem we have. We have a few issues, but on the whole, this will solve it for us. We wanted predictability at the front end. We absolutely needed that, because when you increase the number of people, they need to know what they can consume and how they can consume it, rather than guess. And that's why GraphQL was brought in. It was effectively done to remove those problems. There is one more thing, and people don't talk about it, is the one request model. We wanted to make one request back to the server and get all the data back without making multiple requests. That was imperative.
And I think a lot of times people talk about that as one of the first technical benefits they can see with GraphQL. But I heard you talk about stress, and I wonder if maybe the story here is about not just developer productivity, but every company, I'm sure this is true at RS Components, is under this intense pressure to ship really great customer experiences. And on top of that, developers want to enjoy the work and feel productive.
Yes.
And I think one of the real secrets of GraphQL's success and the rapid spread that we've seen is that it's a joy to use. It elevates the work that teams are doing. You come from the product side of the house, and I'm fond of something I was told once. A product engineer said, look, I signed up to make an amazing user experience. What I actually do all day is write a bunch of boilerplate code.
Yes.
And to be able to get out of that, sure, there's a quantitative thing we could talk about, saves this much time, but there's also, what I'm hearing is maybe even more of a cultural shift, or a qualitative,
well, I mean,
in what life is like at a company that's gone down this path. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, if you think about it, if you think about it at an empirical level, let's say you have numerous REST services in your company, right? And each one of them has its own set of documentation, whether you use Swagger or not, whatever your flavor is. The best way to think about this is always from the perspective of, what does a new employee feel like when they join your organization, right? How fast can you onboard that employee and make them productive? Okay.
Right.
So at the end of the day, effectively, from GraphQL's perspective, it's like, okay, everything you need to build any kind of product or any kind of innovation, you'll find it here. You don't have to waste time going anywhere or ask questions. Whatever you want to build on top of this. And it takes that burden of talking to the right people, finding the right endpoints. Am I allowed to use this in this way? There's a whole set of problems that you take away when you have one endpoint fully documented, that GraphQL does. And that's absolutely critical. How are you going to build innovative products if your engineers spend most of their time trying to find where the data is coming from? Like, how does that work? And unless you got some spectacular way of organizing things. Well, what's
You know,
you share that viewpoint?
I heard another point recently, which is if you think about the incentives of teams that are building software, even if you know that there's a REST endpoint available, even if you know there's a piece of data in your organization that would be a good fit for the user experience you're building,
Yeah.
developers aren't necessarily incentivized to make that connection because that's signing up for a long-term commitment to this tight coupling between that particular API, this particular user experience. And I think one of the interesting trends of the last decade or two has been the rise of this developer-led mindset where more and more business decisions get made by the engineering teams that are building the products and the infrastructure that powers those products.
Mm.
And I think recognizing that there's an incentive that in one case, you've got teams that are really at their best when they avoid touching too much data. And then with the graph, you have a completely different situation where it encourages and it rewards bringing that to the users and creating these data-rich experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's one of the interesting things I'm hearing here that connects the technical benefits of GraphQL with the business benefits and why organizations are taking this to market and to scale.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're in an organization and you want to truly innovate, then you have to figure out where the pain points are in the organization and effectively remove kind of all unnecessary cognitive friction involved in the hows and the wheres. You have a vision and you want to build it. You want to do it unimpeded.
Yeah.
It's you know it's like having a master carpenter and then hiding their tools. Well, like how's he going to get, or he or she going to do anything if they spend half their time finding the tool to do the job that they want to do?
Yeah.
So it's you bring everything that's required for that engineer to build something right up to the edge that they need it for, and then you say, right, okay, you guys run with it, go and do what you want.
Let me ask about the cultural impact that's had. So you've made this change. We'll talk about the scale of that in a little bit, maybe, but I think the idea that you're creating a culture that rewards the sort of development work that you're talking about, that changes the contracts that developers have with their data and the relationship they have. What impact have you seen from that? And I ask because I find a lot of the companies that come to us, especially when they're ready to scale the graph, they've had success at the team level, the developers love it. And they're asking the question, how do I grow the graph across my whole org? And I think the savviest immediately want to understand what impact is that going to have on my organization? How's that going to change how I do software development? And how do I leverage that and benefit from that? And I'm curious what your experience has been and what you've found at RS.
What specifically from scaling it?
Scaling in the sense of what's it like now that so many developers can use a graph? What change does that have maybe culturally or the way that teams work?
Okay, so there's a catch on that. Okay, so for it to be successful in your organization, you have to somehow get the adoption of GraphQL to critical mass. Okay, and if you say it is all or nothing, you will end up spending your entire time building this perfect thing that will never really happen. Okay, so if we decided not to go for the global thing in the first instance, it was a divide and conquer situation for us, because we quickly realized that if we go for the utopian vision at the start, well, we'll still probably be doing it 5 years from now, and all the interest that we drummed up at the start will effectively be dead, wasted. So effectively, we thought about this and thought, right, well, could we reuse the backend for front end pattern, which is, could we split GraphQL down and produce aggregated layers across several domains in the company? That is, dissect the problem down so that the solution for that layer was easier to compose rather than a giant graph. So effectively, the company will then logically split up into teams, and those teams who are in charge of building their front end experiences were said, well, build your data fetching requirements in GraphQL, and don't be concerned about what any other team needs to do just yet. Fix you, then we'll fix us. So it was a divide and conquer thing. Now it's the federation bit that's actually helping us to do the global aspect, and that's where we're going to be migrating to now. So
and that's sorry, go ahead.
No, I interrupted you. You carry on.
And that's the secret, I think, is empowering each team to own its concern, to be able to model its data, to be able to ship that graph into their application to solve their needs.
Absolutely.
And to do that in a way that, look, we all know the future's coming. We don't know what it will bring, but we know that the investments we make today in data or in user experience are going to be used in new ways. We know that we're going to create new products, new categories. And I think the key that you're getting at is empower everyone to solve their problem today and to bring all that together tomorrow in new ways.
Absolutely.
To think about a composable world.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't treat it atomically. Compose the complexity. It just doesn't work, especially at the scale RS operates. There are different people, different mindsets, and teams with different cadences. So it didn't seem like the right decision to have one global team implement all the services required by others when they themselves are the domain experts. So they will make it faster than us. So effectively now in the company, we have these multiple aggregation layers that are dotted around. And what is effectively done is allowed everybody to wet their feet, so to speak, and understand schema design, because with the whole with the whole thing, with great power comes great responsibility. Schema design, if done wrong, can actually be equally as catastrophic. You have to be intelligent about how you design the schema. You have to be clever about it, but you do that through experience. You have to build the experience up. So that now the teams have experience, they know where there were pitfalls, and now we leverage the experience amongst everyone. It's crowdsourced rather than a single team.
Yeah, and that connects back to what you said earlier. The graph really sings at scale. There's a critical mass. It's a network. It's a literal network of data, right? And so you want to get from one team to two teams to the organization. You want to do it incrementally. You want to show value along the way. So teams have to ship something that connects to a engineering deliverable or a business result. And this point you're making, I think, is so critical, and we should underline it 20 times. The secret, I think, of graph done right is agility. It's experimentation. It's treating it the way you would treat a product. It's that culture that you're talking about. This comes natural, I think, for product engineers. Look, we're going to ship our first thing. We'll see what the users say. We're going to experiment. We're going to learn. And that's so different from, I think, your classic API design approach. Very waterfall, very top down, very slow.
I've done this, now consume it.
Right, exactly. And maybe that's the insight here is, as you empower teams, give them some space, give them some room to learn,
Yeah,
and create the structure. And I think this is what Federation's all about. This is really what like the graph practice at a company is all about. Create a structure where all of that adds up to something bigger than the just some of its parts. It's something that as teams experience that and bring their piece of the graph into production and solve their issue, then you can solve the bigger questions, and you can set them up to plug into something that's at the scale of the whole organization.
Yeah, I think if I was to provide any lesson, I think the most important thing is be pragmatic. Be pragmatic. You know, the whole thing about Rome was not built in a day. You know, it's not a cliche. It's literal. Everything starts with the first stone. You build something one by one by one, and the critical bit is try to do just enough that if you go wrong, you can reverse and learn. Like, don't travel the path so far that it becomes utterly impossible to step backwards without destroying it all. Try and have small steps, small formulaic purpose and deliberate steps forward, and try to learn from the last point, always the last point that you did something. Never try to go in with what does perfect look like, let's build perfect. Never is. If that was the case, like, there'd never be a version 2 of anything.
That's right.
Or a version 3 or a version 4. If that was the case, that would never be the case. So you've got to adopt that, just as you said, the product mentality. Understand that what you build now, from the second that you've committed it to Git and you've deployed it, it's already old code. It's already an old solution from that point. So it's pragmatism. I think that's the most important thing. Never feel pressure to build something perfect.
I think that's really well put. There's some questions coming in that tie to this around, you mentioned earlier, getting the schema right. What have you learned on that front? What have you learned from a perspective of the right way to think about schema design, or the kinds of patterns that you've found or ways of working together that work best?
So I think one of the most critical ones are when you look at your schema design, do you have some kind of indication of what it's doing without documentation, what it's trying to do? 2, don't try to push the concerns from the back to the front, which is, let's say you have a database. Don't try to mirror that all the way to the front. Don't bring any aspects of the back to the front. So try to make your schema general, like, as in, always take into consideration that when you're building a schema, if this was a product in its own right and you was going to release it and someone's going to pay you money to consume your schema from a third party perspective, could you do that using the design that you currently got? That's probably one of the most important things that I've learned. Keep things generic, keep things composable, and don't produce something that feels monolithic. Like, kind of really dive into the culture of the type system, and logically separate your data into those types. You know, it takes practice, but I think the most important thing is make those mistakes. Make those mistakes initially, a step back, and even give it to someone who's never seen your schema and say, can you use this?
And that question's really the acid test, isn't it? It's, would someone use this product? Would someone buy this product?
Yes.
If your product is that piece of the graph, that piece of the schema.
Yeah.
And that makes me think about questions like documentation.
Yeah.
And how do we show people when you come to the graph, it's your first day on the job, let's say, or it's your first day being a partner, and we should talk about outside consumers of the graph at some point. Do I want to use this thing?
Yes. Yeah. Can I?
Can I look at the schema? Do the names make sense? Does the documentation explain how I should do it? Something we're eager to roll out as part of the Apollo platform is even a richer experience around, here's some example queries that use this. Here's some other use cases of this. Here are other teams that are using this data. Like just this richer and richer experience around, help me understand not just what's in the graph from a technical perspective, but like why I care and how I should use it the right way.
Yeah. It's you know, make it descriptive. Don't go OTT. But like if you didn't see the documentation and you saw the schema, you'd have some kind of understanding what this is alluding to, what's actually happening here. If you can't do that, start again or revise it. It's that iterative loop. Keep learning, and you'll just know you'll know when it's correct.
And that's classic product development too, right? You should build that first version of the schema. You know it won't be the right one in some sense. And you should build it for one user or one team or one audience.
Yeah.
And get feedback. And then you can go find your next customer and your next customer after that. And the idea that you're going to know on day one what the first 100 customers need doesn't carry water. That wouldn't make sense to any seasoned product team. It's more of a journey from here to there. And the only way to make the journey is to start with a really focused use case. We often tell people start with one component on your screen.
Yes. Yeah.
And just the simplest schema, even if it's 2 types and 5 fields, and start that loop, just as you said. Start that process where you're soliciting input, you're getting feedback, you're having a conversation about this, and it naturally flows in the direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the schema design is it could become a literal art form. Like it is extraordinarily difficult to do perfectly, but it's not that difficult to do well. And aim for well. Like I said, don't fear mistakes. And again, it's what you said before. The most important way to see it is if a new person joined, or if there was a third party consumer, could they? That's the most powerful advice that you could give.
And I think one thing we've found is often the team that first sees the value of a graph at scale, when they come to us, they're thinking in terms of technical questions. And those are important questions, right?
Absolutely.
From a performance perspective, how's this going to work? Is it, we could talk about that for hours. But I think one of the things that comes up pretty early is they realize I need to help other teams see that light. And I need to, a big part of the job of a graph champion is teaching the right way for teams to take this iterative approach, teaching sort of the art of schema design, if I can call it that, and teaching the way that teams collaborate. Because if you get that right, the natural gravity of the graph, this network effect, starts to solve all the other problems, because you bring more and more of the company into that picture, and it creates just clarity around which things need to be solved from a performance or a monitoring or an operational perspective. But without that, you don't have maybe the flywheel that really makes it come together.
Yeah,
and there's
absolutely.
a couple.
Has your mic dropped off? I don't know if you can hear me.
Let's pause for
Oh, there you go. There you go. You're back.
Okay. Who knows?
Yeah.
What I was saying is, you had talked about let each team solve its own problem.
Yes.
Let them work in their swim lane. Let them ship their piece of the graph. So there's some questions that have come in about, well, sure, that sounds great, but how do you resolve the conflicts that come up? How do you handle cases where different teams all want maybe the same type in the schema, or where when you do have the conversation, as you bring teams together, you find that they've maybe duplicated effort or have overlap in what they've been thinking or designing. Can you talk a little bit about resolving that or how that process works?
See, I personally think the conflicts are good because it highlights points in the system that are important. If for instance someone's creating the same type again and again, you clearly know there is a lot of significance on this type, so you better get this right. It also proves that because there are more people out there, more domain experts, you know exactly who to leverage to get this correct as well. So the actual problems are actually more useful than every team doing it well in the first place. So, you know, embrace that aspect
It's
and
signal.
learn from it. Yes, it's a signal. It's an absolute signal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. It's and as you said before, the goal here is not a perfect data modeling.
No.
We don't want the top-down ontology and end up with a perfect schema. That doesn't exist. You know, I was on the phone yesterday with one of the larger US retailers, and they said, you know, we actually have 3 or 4 different notions of a product type.
Okay.
And those are built on different systems. And they were trying to understand what's the best way to harmonize that or bring all that together. And what we found as we had the conversation is this is normal. It's normal to have multiple systems in your business that each have their own concept of, say, a product or an inventory status.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're not always in perfect agreement is not necessarily a problem. That's just a fact about your business. You might have 2 different ways to look at real-time inventory in your stores.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
you should probably put both of them in the graph. That's not a bug in the graph. That's actually a reflection of what you have, and it's a way to elevate the value of that data. And maybe over time you find that products have been using one view on inventory when really they should use another view.
Yeah.
Maybe you can connect your developers to a more appropriate piece of the graph that better represents what they want. But it starts with showing what you have and connecting that to the broader organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're lucky our RS components because the teams are actually quite logically split up. There's not too many concerns that overlap, but there are some. I mean, for instance, we have the notion of product and orders and accounts as such, and you can understand on a website how those concerns would cut across each other. Now, the problem that you arrive at when you have multiple aggregators is that you've fundamentally then defeated the whole point of GraphQL, because all you've done is built layers, GraphQL layers that are now separate from each other. So if you say, well, okay, well, if you want that data, you have to go over there. If you want that data, you have to go over there, which feels self-defeating in a way. But it was always part of the strategy because it first allowed us to collect all the implementational details.
Yes.
So once we'd collected those, which was absolutely empirical to the way forward, it's like, right, how the heck do we glue all this back together without losing all of our hair? And that's where we started looking at, and this was 2 years ago, mind you, the schema stitching. So we ended up looking at stuff like that, but we kind of realized at that point that wasn't for us. It was back then it felt too manual. at that point in time, and it didn't feel as if the solution back then was going to scale with our needs. We needed a way to do it not autonomously, but we needed as little friction as possible, right? So we were like, well, okay, well, we need to do the what, but we're not concerned with the how. And I think that's where the federation story fundamentally fitted in, because it allowed us to kind of dissociate ourselves from the nuts and bolts of the implementational detail, so to speak, and just think about, from an organizational perspective, how the heck are we going to glue it together? And once we'd abstracted ourselves away from the bits and bytes and as such, we were kind of able to logically work through the problem from a much higher level, and that's what helped. That's what helped us a lot.
Federation is glue. It's composability. It's not
Absolutely.
a perspective on the right way to model data top down.
No,
and
it's a tool.
I think this point you're making is so critical. A lot of companies, I think, find themselves at this moment. They recognize the value of scaling the graph. They recognize that there's going to be overlap. They recognize that there are multiple teams. I mean, often you have this setting where companies were built piece by piece over decades. These teams have built using different technologies. They've been potentially acquisitions, mergers, reorgs. What makes companies valuable is all of that accumulated work and data. And the goal shouldn't be to wave a magic wand, wait a couple of years, add an egg, stir, and come up with the perfect result. The goal should be acceleration and iteration and agility.
And that's the key. We had a small team at RS who were involved in doing looking after this graph, so to speak, and kind of doing the thought experiments and doing the think tanks around it and figuring out, well, okay, we've really only got this much resource. We've got this sizable problem. Well, how the hell are we going to do this? So, I mean, we could have gone down the whole, well, we'll do it ourselves. We'll absolutely do it ourselves. But then, you know what? You have to be honest with yourself, because let's say you paid the bills, like of the company, right? Let's say you paid the bills of all the employees and everyone else, and you suddenly interested in the profits. Would building your own federation or own kind of gateway-esque application boost the profits per se? It wouldn't. It's not in line with what the company does. So that's why we reached out and we ended up with the federated approach, because it's effectively you're building on the shoulder of giants, as that term goes. You're leveraging another product to accelerate your development, and it ticked enough boxes for us to know that this is the right approach for us. It allowed us to see that we can fundamentally compose all of these disparate aggregation layers through another layer, and then have the gateway stitch it, and then suddenly you've got one graph that everybody can go to, and it's not that difficult to work with. I mean, was that your intent all the way along? Is that something that when you thought of federation at you guys at the company, was that a viewpoint all along?
We've had the opportunity to hear from a lot of companies adopting GraphQL over the years, and what was so clear from early on was this theme that you keep coming back to. Developers love this stuff. It's night and day. You don't have to write all this code. You have better tools. We haven't even talked about some of the benefits at that level, but strong typing in your UI, or being able to write a query in your editor and have a estimate of whether that query is going to be expensive to fetch
Yeah.
all the data or cheap.
Yeah.
These just magical moments for teams that are adopting this and finding success with it. And what kept coming up was this question of, I see how valuable this gets as it grows in scope. I don't want two graphs long-term at my company that I have to switch back and forth between. I want one big one. I want to be able to have a catalog of all my data, and I want people to have that amazing welcoming experience that you talked about before. Day one on the job, here's the graph.
Yes. Yeah.
How do I navigate that? How do I explore that? How do I understand how best to use it and who else is using it? And that led us to Federation. Is honestly, it's the simplest thing that could possibly work. It's just like GraphQL, it's declarative. It lets us build tools around that experience. It lets us have a query plan that we can analyze and optimize. It lets us do an analysis of which clients are using which pieces of data. And especially when you're managing a graph at scale where you've got 30, 40, 50 teams that are each owning and contributing a piece of that graph, structure is everything. And it's what we've seen at every layer of the stack, right? I think that's the story of Docker and Kubernetes and cloud native infrastructure. It's composability. Teams used to have to be very good at running services to be able to run a service, but now increasingly that's all a common fabric that they can plug into. And it's the story of React, where in a modern UI, in 2021, you build UI components for composability.
Yeah.
Because you'll want to mix and match them in different ways, and you'll want to have the flexibility to bring things together on a screen and know that they won't collide with each other. And I think the graph in Federation is just exactly that for your API. It's the first real way that we've been able to have multiple teams collaborate on a common API and not entangle with each other. You can't go edit someone else's REST endpoint. You have no idea what the consequence of that would be. But with a graph, you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot during the early days. There was a lot of contention with the whole GraphQL thing. It's like one of the problems we found at the start, less so now because pretty much everyone's clued up. We've kind of shouted GraphQL long enough now that everyone's pretty much they know what's going on. But at the start, I do feel, Matt, that when we mentioned that, it felt like an alien technology, and I felt as if for a lot of people it felt out of reach in terms of onboarding, in terms of I just don't want to learn something new. This looks like, what is this? How is this going to improve my life? It looks too complicated. Is it another protocol? What is it? And there was a whole series of issues that we hadn't contended with, that we had to get over, which was explaining what it actually is and removing any worries around it.
The other thing we found, and I think developers have caught on to a lot of what you and I've been talking about. The other thing we found is when people are asking, how do I help spread this graph faster in my organization? The thing we found works really well is to start by talking about the benefits of a graph at scale.
Yeah.
And they're so clear, and there's such good, I think, evidence of how quickly the world's moving digital, how vital it is to have a world-class customer experience, and how important it is to bring data to your customers. And we can talk about it at that level, and success at scale means getting buy-in across the organization. And I think if you try to have the conversation about bytes on the wire or strong typing in the UI, you'll get developer support, but that won't build the kind of support you want across other parts of the organization. What we find works really well is to convey this picture of the value of the graph for the business, like you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And then the question is simple. The question is, how do we do it? And
Yes.
that's
Yes.
where, well, I'll tell you how you do it. You go team by team. You build schemas that make sense. You build schemas people would want to use. You
Yeah.
build in a way that anticipates the need to compose and connect and glue this stuff together. But you don't try to build Rome in a day.
No.
You just go piece by piece, bit by bit. And
That's all it is. That's the secret.
yeah, you're going to have a story for how to have a life cycle for every piece of your graph. How are you going to retire fields that aren't being used? How are you going to communicate to teams about new fields that are now available, and what sort of support agreement, in some sense, the owner of that field is going to sign up for? Stories about security and all these things, but these are solvable, would be my point, as the company sees the value of going in this direction and doing it step by step.
Absolutely. And you see, the introduction of GraphQL into an organization, when done right, and when the penny drops for the developer engineer, and it's an almost joyous experience. That is, you're telling me I can do this, and it will only return this, and I don't need to concern myself with this whole lot of data I don't need. And then from the business's perspective, it was like, you're saying that this team can build faster, they can increase their cadence for delivery, because simply because you've just taken this massive concern off their plate and they no longer have to contend with it. You probably already appreciate this, but until you come into a large organization, you never fully appreciate how much of a time sink and a drain it is to find the data that you need to build the thing that you want. Okay, it really saps any kind of enthusiasm out of you, because it's then not one job, it's multiple jobs. You're doing multiple things to get that one story completed.
Right.
Well, why would you want to do that? Like, you want to make it as easy as possible. So for the sake of efficiencies from a business perspective, it's a win-win. And without sounding, carry on.
Go ahead.
Well, without sounding like too techie, even from people that are worried about the implementation of GraphQL, so what's the point? Like, so what? Why do I need to make one connection out? Well, in the new age, when we live in the mobile space, like, making the minimum number of connections out, calling for data, has an impact. You want to minimize radio usage on a mobile phone, and one of the things that we evangelized at RS, when people were a bit confused as to what about GraphQL, why would we need it? Well, imagine this for a second. Imagine you're making 3 calls and there are 100 hops from every router up until right up to the end service, right? Say 50% of those hops are public and 50% of them are in your VPC. Okay, now if you make 3 calls, you made 150 slow hops, so to speak, when really technically you want to make 1 hop to the data, your VPC, and then 3 high-speed hops to your upstream services. So it's not just it looks beautiful, you do it correctly, there's actually a massive efficiency gain as well. So
yeah, and mobile motivated a lot of the early ideas in GraphQL. Every e-commerce company I've talked to can talk about the business value of lower latency.
Yes.
And by the way, we've been talking about the server side of this, but one of the exciting things I think about the graph is how
You've gone, I'm going to try and guess what you're saying. You're saying, I need to buy new headphones, a new mic. Not yet. While you fix that, I'll carry on with the front end space then. So it was quite empowering from the front end perspective, simply because they suddenly realized they could rely. I'll let you know exactly when you chime in. So from the front end perspective, it really empowered the engineers, because what effectively happened is, rather than guess what the REST endpoints were going to return, they were promised that this is going to be returned back. And the amount of confidence that gives, because I don't care which way you cut it, front end development is actually very, it's very complex, right? You see, there's a whole new set of concerns you're dealing with on the front end, which maybe some people, probably don't appreciate too much until you get into it. But from the front end perspective, it was the predictable nature of it. That's the most powerful thing that GraphQL provided, is that it allowed you to predict what was going to happen. Whereas before, you just didn't, unless you had contract tests left, right, and center, which itself is draining. It's that level of foresight that I want this, and I am going to get this, and I can bind that data object directly to a React front end. No transformations required whatsoever. You bind the data to that. You don't need to
that
check.
opens the door for all of these performance optimizations, for a more cohesive experience. And we can connect that to these business metrics, whether it's latency, or whether it's time to interaction, or whether it's the NPS of people that use the application, because the old handwritten version of this stuff was too buggy to work at scale, and people would have to close the app after a while. And I think that prize is extraordinary for companies that are facing some sort of a competitive landscape in digital. Because the companies that get this right, and I just think about companies that are great at software development, companies that have invested in this and have gotten good at building world-class user experiences, whether they're in e-commerce or music or content or media, it hardly matters. There's someone we can look at as a beacon of excellence. And I think the thing we have found that helps teams make the case for the graph at scale is to identify with that and recognize that this is a key part of the strategy for us getting good at software, for getting closer to our users.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I could wax lyrical about all the things that GraphQL does, and all the things that I feel that it lacks at. But really, you know what? It comes down to the most important thing when you're working at scale and you've got multiple teams is the predictability. Because you see, if you're one person, you understand the domain, you understand if you change something here, you changed it, so there's going to be an impact there because you did all of it. But once you've split that across two teams and they've said they're now working out of process, one team doesn't know the impact that they're going to have on another team.
That's right.
So and now imagine you fragment that further and further and further. Well, you've got to have some kind of glue that's a constant between all of them. There has to be a constant in the equation for it to work. And that's what the GraphQL kind of backbone provides, is that constant. You can rely on me. I am going to provide you this, forever and a day. And you don't need to worry about it. In fact, not only will I provide you this, I'll tell you what the types are going to be, so you can bind it to your UI or whatever you need to do. So it's how much it allows you to predict what's going to happen. That's the most powerful thing at scale.
I hear clarity. It creates clarity.
Yes,
the GraphQL schema is clear in a way that a REST endpoint really isn't, because so much of the important detail is left unsaid. And that creates clarity about maybe everything from the performance of the application to your delivery schedules, to the consistency across different platforms. And
absolutely.
that's I think a really key insight is it gets your developers and your development practice closer to the business by being able to provide a clearer contract with the rest of the company. Here's what we can do. Here's what we have.
I mean, talking about contracts, one of the most powerful features that we kind of oversaw initially and didn't pay too much credence to was the contract managements in Apollo Studio, knowing which clients are consuming which aspect of the graph.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So you can imagine how powerful that is, because then you suddenly know that if an engineer accidentally makes a change and they break the contract, well, the system will tell us ahead of time, you can't do that. This number of clients will actually break.
And it goes beyond CI. It's also insights.
Yes.
Who's using my data? I mean, what microservice owner doesn't want to know at that fine grain level what clients are out there and which piece of my payload is actually relevant to them? And the parts that aren't, is that an opportunity to retire them and minimize my surface area, or maybe it's an opportunity to advocate for them that there's data that they're not taking advantage of? That's another form of clarity the graph creates that isn't possible with a point-to-point API, because you just don't have the language to ask the question, and you don't have the data to support the answer.
Yeah, there's no way on a REST endpoint, unless you do clever things. You ask it, you give an ID, and it will just splat out an entire object, whether you want it or not. You can't track which attributes on that people are using. I would say it's actually incredibly important for growth and growing your graph for you to analyze and analyze it over time and understand the usage patterns so you know how to grow it. Without that, you can't do it.
Yeah. We're right up at the end of time, so let me ask one last question. Looking back on all of this, what's changed about the business? Now that you've taken this path with the graph, what's different about RS, and how do you think about all of this from the perspective of what's next?
So what's changed is there is I would say there's from a data perspective, there's an increased amount of confidence in the direction that we're going, especially now that federations come into effect, that we are not that far away now from that utopian goal of the single data graph. Like it's changed. I would say it's changed the viewpoint of, there's more optimism in that sense. That's what it is. So it's the same everywhere. People need to do less work but be more productive, and I think at RS now we're at the cusp now where we understand the vision going forward, and we just have to now complete those little jobs to get that end goal complete. But like you said, one bit at a time. But I would say it feels more dynamic and it feels more optimistic.
It feels like a forward-thinking organizational culture shift that is about getting great at software.
And I think once that data graph goes fully live and we have more integrations into and more tentacles into all the parts of the company, I think it's really going to revolutionize the way the company works. Literally, it's not a metaphorical term, it's literal. It's really going to revolutionize what happens, because I think all those experiences and ideas that everyone's got, suddenly there's going to be nothing holding them back, because, well, okay, well, what you need to build is right. The building blocks you need are right there. Do it.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Daljit, thank you again for taking the hour to do this. I really enjoyed the conversation and hear the story. I think you've really made such an important point around agility and around culture change and around the value of, as a business, being good at shipping world-class software for teams. And hearing that path is, hopefully we covered a lot of the ground that were in the questions we saw. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. This is a really great opportunity to share this and communicate some of the value, and we're eager to help you make the same come at your organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It has been like, I can't believe it's been an hour. To be honest with you, it feels like we just got started.
Time flies.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity, as well as on behalf of RS. And if anyone's interested, we are actually hiring for the Federation team.
There it is. The classic "we're hiring" at the end of the conversation. I think that's the other, everybody can see it. GraphQL will help you hire a really great team. It's a technology that people want to be using.
Hey, it's the mandatory ending, Matt.
It is, absolutely. So on that note, thank you everyone, and enjoy your weeks. Cheers.